Hello students, I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on Rubin and Babbie chapter 16. So let's go ahead and get started. So we are still in unit 4, which is related to designs for evaluating programs in practice. We have already covered chapters 11 through 14, and now we are moving on to our final chapter in this unit, which is related to survey research. One thing to keep in mind with regard to survey research is that it is typically utilized and is most appropriate when dealing with large sources of data. Another topic that is closely linked to survey research is that of sampling, and I will discuss that in greater detail in the next video lecture. We are still in phase 3 of the social work research process, which is related to choosing a research design and data collection methods. We're also continuing to explore the interrelationship between the concepts of research design, inference, and causal inference. We're also continuing to look at the difference between group and individual research designs. And what we now know is that single case designs are most appropriate for individual clients. And by contrast, experimental and quasi-experimental designs are most appropriate for groups of clients. In addition, we also know that program evaluation designs are the most flexible design that we have covered thus far, in that they are appropriate for individual clients as well as groups of clients. And what we will learn through today's video lecture is that survey research designs are most appropriate for individual clients. In terms of the relationship between research design and inference, the question really is whether the survey research design is cross-sectional or longitudinal in nature. So we know that cross-sectional designs involve collection of data at one point in time. And given this design, we are only able to draw basic correlational inferences. However, with survey research designs that are longitudinal in nature, which involve collecting data over an extended period of time, this kind of design allows for drawing causal inferences. So as we think about survey research designs, we really have to ask the question of whether the design is cross-sectional or longitudinal in nature, as this determines the kind of inference that we are able to reasonably draw. So now let's dive further into the topic of survey research designs. So survey research is defined as the collection of information from a sample of individuals through their responses to questions. Surveys can be used for exploring any research purpose, whether it be exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, or evaluative in nature. Overall, survey research is the best method for studying populations that are too large to observe directly. Finally, careful probability sampling allows us to study a group of respondents or a sample whose characteristics are taken to reflect those of the larger target population. And so in the next video lecture, I will focus strictly on the topic of sampling, and I will talk about the difference between probability and non-probability sampling. But the most important thing to keep in mind in this video lecture is that survey research designs make studying large populations feasible. In terms of strengths and weaknesses of survey research, I will point out a couple of the strengths as well as the weaknesses, and then I will allow you to review the others in your own time. So some of the strengths. One major strength of survey research is that it is useful for studying the characteristics of large populations, as I just mentioned. And similarly, it makes studying very large samples feasible. In addition, because survey research allows us to gather information on a number of topics, it also allows for analyzing multiple variables simultaneously. In terms of weaknesses, as I have mentioned previously, survey research is limited in its ability to show causality unless the survey design is longitudinal in nature. Survey research In addition, survey research seldom deals with the context of social life. So what is meant by this is that survey research by nature is quantitative. And from quantitative research, we are able to produce numbers. And so, for this reason, numbers are very limited in their ability to speak to context. And so, this is where qualitative research comes in. Qualitative research helps us to understand the context behind the numbers. So, this is one weakness of research that we must consider. Surveys can be superficial in their coverage of complex topics as the same definitions of concepts are uniformly applied across respondents, despite potential variations in the meaning of those concepts from respondent to respondent. So essentially, what is being conveyed here is that in survey research, we have a particular set of questions that we are administering uniformly across all respondents. And so the assumption is that all respondents will interpret the questions in the same way and will ascribe the same meaning to the questions. And so we know that this is not necessarily true. And so this is definitely a limitation of survey research. In addition, surveys typically require that the initial study design remain unchanged. Essentially, once we have laid the groundwork in the beginning of our study in terms of deciding on the problem that we will focus on, conceptually defining our variables, as well as operationalizing each of our variables, and developing our conceptual framework, once we have put in place all of those measures in the beginning phases of the research process, it is very unlikely that those things will change over the course of the research process. These things typically remain set in stone and unchanged as we progress through the research process. So it is very likely that a researcher will be unaware of any new variable that may come up that may be important to take into consideration. So this is another limitation of survey research is that typically the designs that we put in place are not very flexible once we have established the design. And so these are some of the things to keep in mind with regard to strengths and weaknesses of survey research. Your text talks about 4 different types of surveys. One is the self-administered questionnaire, another is the interview survey, the telephone survey, and finally the online survey. So let's take a closer look at the self-administered questionnaire. So in this method, respondents are asked to complete questionnaires on their own. The most typical method of administering a questionnaire is via a mail survey. Your text provides several helpful considerations for mail surveys, and they include mail distribution and return, writing a quality cover letter, monitoring returns, conducting a follow-up mailing, as well as response rates and ways of increasing response rates. And so, in terms of mail distribution and return, a common reason for not returning questionnaires is that it's too much trouble. And so, in order to overcome this problem, we want to make every effort that we can to develop ways to make returning the survey easier. And one of the ways in which we can do this is by providing a prepaid and addressed envelope. So, essentially, we want to ensure that we take the necessary steps to eliminate any and all barriers to returning surveys. Another thing that we would want to take into consideration is the cover letter. The cover letter is the first thing that participants see. And so we really want to make sure that we write a quality cover letter that motivates responses and alleviates resistance. In addition, as we are receiving surveys back in the mail, we want to make sure that we put in place an effective system of tracking returns so that we know and are aware of those individuals that we need to follow up with. So after the first initial mailing, we always want to do at least one follow-up mailing to our non-respondents. And so we want to ensure in this follow-up mailing that we include a new copy of the survey in the event that the individual may have misplaced the original survey that was sent. And then we also want to include a cover letter. Finally, with regard to response rates, we want to make sure that our response rate is as close to 100% as possible. And your text talks about how there's a lot of argument around what the ideal percentage is for response rates. But generally speaking, the closer to 100%, the better. So response rates by definition is the number of people participating in a survey divided by the number of people asked to participate. So if we have asked 200 individuals to participate in this survey, but yet only 100 actually participate, this will be a response rate of 75%. Your text also gives some helpful guidelines in terms of increasing response rates, or some of the methods that we can put in place in order to help to increase response rates. And they include writing a good cover letter, keeping the survey short, and the rule of thumb given by your text is about 10 to 15 minutes, offering to share survey results with respondents because there are times when folks actually want to know what the outcome of the study is. So we want to ensure that we offer that opportunity. And then finally, if at all possible, we want to provide incentives for participation. In terms of the interview survey, in this method, rather than asking respondents to complete questionnaires on their own, trained survey interviewers are asked the questions orally and trained survey interviewers ask the questions orally and record respondents' answers. Interviews are typically done face to face, but can also be done by telephone. Interviews typically attain higher response rates than mail surveys, typically because respondents are less likely to turn down someone that is standing in front of them. So in terms of the role of the survey interviewer, your text also talks about some of the advantages of having trained survey interviewers to administer surveys. Specifically, interviewers can help to improve the completeness of questionnaires, guard against confusing questions, and probe for answers. And what is meant by probe for answers is, for example, if a participant is having a difficult time with answering a particular survey question, the interviewer might probe and say, if you had to pick one answer, which one do you think would come closest to your feelings? So this is not to suggest that the survey interviewer is in any way coercing the respondent to answer. We never want to force anyone to complete a survey because research is always voluntary. But to the extent that they are able to, they may probe for answers in order to promote completeness of the survey. So where possible, it is okay to probe for responses. In terms of general guidelines for survey interviewing, your text talks about several of them, and they include appearance and demeanor, familiarity with the questionnaire, ensuring that the interviewer follows the question wording exactly, as well as that they record responses exactly, and as I just mentioned, where possible, that they probe for responses. So in terms of appearance and demeanor, it's important that the interviewer dress in a fashion that is similar to that of the people who will be interviewed. This will allow for interviewees to feel more comfortable, and also it will promote attaining a greater sense of cooperation from interviewees as well. In terms of familiarity with the questionnaire, it's important that the interviewer be familiar with the survey tool that they are utilizing. If not, the interview is likely to take way more time than is actually necessary and may just be generally unpleasant for both the interviewee and the interviewer. Furthermore, it's important that those who are conducting the interviews are following the question wording exactly. Questionnaires can be very, very difficult to construct, and it's a very intentional effort in that the questions that are included in the questionnaire are phrased in such a way to obtain the information that is needed and to ensure that respondents will interpret items precisely as intended. So it's very, very important that the interviewer follow the protocol. Similarly, it's also important that the interviewer record the answers from respondents exactly as given. So there shouldn't be any attempt by the interviewer to summarize, paraphrase, or correct for bad grammar. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, it is also appropriate and sometimes necessary that the interviewer seek to probe for responses in order to ensure completeness and accuracy of data. The key thing to keep in mind about probing is that we never want to force anyone to answer questions. In terms of telephone surveys, the greatest advantage of telephone surveys is both money and time. Also, respondents may be more honest in their responses, given that they do not have to look anyone in the eye. And this can make interviewing particularly easier when it comes to probing into very sensitive topics, given the lack of face to face and eye contact. Telephone surveys also allow for protecting the personal safety of interviewers, as they do not require traveling or entering into respondents' personal space. However, one problem that has existed in the past, maybe not so much today, but one problem that has existed previously is that telephone surveys included unlisted numbers. So the problem was that telephone surveys did not include unlisted numbers. So those numbers that were not listed were not included in the sample to be selected for participation in the survey, which led to sampling bias. However, this problem has been rectified through a technique that is referred to as random digit dialing, or RDD. RDD is a method for selecting people for involvement in telephone surveys by generating telephone numbers at random. And so this random generation of telephone numbers includes unlisted numbers that would otherwise be missed. An additional technological advancement that's mentioned in your text is referred to as computer assisted telephone interviewing. And the advantage of this advancement is that all data are collected via a computer. And so, for this reason, it makes the data analysis process much easier because the data that are collected are automatically populated into a database and is available to the researcher for very quick and expeditious download and analysis of results. In terms of online surveys, this is an increasingly popular method of survey research, and I would even venture to say that it's probably the most popular method of survey research these days. Online surveys have the advantage of being quickly and inexpensively sent to a very large number of prospective respondents, not only here in the US, but anywhere in the world. Similar to the CADDI system that I just mentioned, in online surveys, data are also automatically entered for computer processing, eliminating the need for manual data entry and making possible a quick tabulation of results. However, the one downside to the use of online surveys is that respondents are typically most likely to be younger, more affluent, and more highly educated. So by utilizing online surveys, sometimes we can inadvertently exclude certain populations, which can lead to issues of sampling bias. So we always want to consider our population in the selection of our survey method. So for example, in my study of non-resident fathers, because I had taken the time to study my population, I learned that they were a highly transient population. And so I knew that something like an online survey would not go very well. And so I chose to do an interview survey where I sat with participants one-on-one and completed the survey, which helped tremendously in terms of the accuracy of my data, the completeness of my data, and in turn, the validity and reliability of the data that I was able to collect. So we always want to take into consideration our population. If we're dealing with an elderly population, then an online survey may or may not be the best choice. And so, but by contrast, if we're dealing with a younger population, then an online survey may be appropriate. So we always want to take into consideration our population in terms of selecting the survey method that is most beneficial and appropriate for us. So here are some of the online survey tools that are available to the researcher today. These are some of the more popular ones, and they include Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, as well as Google Forms. And this is just a summary of the various advantages and disadvantages of the survey designs that we've discussed. And this is broken down by type of survey. And this is a table that I was able to extract from your texts. I thought it provided a very good synopsis of all of the various different types of surveys, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of each type. So I recommend taking a closer look at this when you get a chance. So in terms of our case study that we continue to draw upon, even as we discuss survey research designs. So we have our conceptual framework here that we have been looking at from the very beginning of our discussion of this case. And we know that we have several different concepts that are part of our conceptual framework. These are all of our independent variables here. And here is our dependent variable. And these are our original research questions. So we know that a part of the beginning phases of the research process involve both conceptualization and operationalization of all of our study variables. And so one of the first thing that we have to one of the first things that we have to do is conceptually define or provide an agreed upon definition for each of the concepts in our study. So we would have to define all 6 concepts. And once we have defined all 6 concepts, then we are able to move toward the process of operationalization, which is where we go about locating survey instruments that will allow us to capture each of the variables in our study so that we're able to observe them in the real world. So I've listed here some potential survey or measurement tools that we could utilize to capture each of our variables. So for depression, I selected the Center for Epidemiologic Studies Depression Scale. For anxiety, I selected the Beck's Anxiety Inventory. For social support, I selected the Perceived Social Support Scale. For the father-son relationship, I selected the Child-Parent Relationship Scale. For experience with childcare, I selected the Parent Involvement in Childcare Scale. And finally, for parenting self-efficacy, I selected the scale that we've been talking about over the past couple of lectures, which is called the Parenting Sense of Competency Scale, more specifically the efficacy subscale. So as you can see, I have operationalized each of the variables in our conceptual framework. And so essentially what I would do from this point is I would compile all the various different questions that are included in each scale into one survey tool that I would administer to each of the participants in my study. And so as you can see, we would have data on a number of variables that we can study the relationships on. So we can look at several different relationships here. We can look at the relationship between each of our independent variables and how they relate to our dependent variable. And then we can also study how each of the independent variables relate to each other. So there are a number of different types of tests that we can run and ways in which we can go about analyzing our data and looking at and examining the relationship between a number of combinations of variables. And so this is essentially how we would go about applying a survey research design to the case study that we have been examining over the course of the past few lectures. So that is essentially all that I have for this lecture, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Here's my contact information as always, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.